Perfect order is right around the corner, and today we're going to be ranking every single interesting card from the set. The set releases on the 27th of March and then becomes legal for play on the 10th of April. And it's also worth keeping in mind that alongside this set, the standard format is going to be changing, with every single card from G Block rotating out. That means no more Gardevoir, no more Goldengo, no more Charizard, and a completely new look at the Pokémon TCG.
Myself and Jack throughout the video will be talking here and there about the cards that we're losing and how that will affect the new age builds of some of these new archetypes, or how these cards can slot into existing lists as little reminders throughout the video, but just be aware that this is coinciding with rotation and really will change a lot about the discussion throughout today's video. First up then, we have the item card Energy Swatter. Your opponent reveals their hand, and you choose an energy card you find there and put it to the bottom of your opponent's deck. Trying essentially just to hide cards away from the opponent and maybe buy yourself a turn of attacking isn't going to be too easy in this format because we are losing some key hand disruptors. You have to maybe try and time this card with your ace spec, or you have to try and combine it with some annoying abilities in the game like the new Vivillon or new Talonflame coming out in the format, or possibly even alongside like a Claw of Darkness attack to really have huge impact, because there still will be a number of like engine Pokemon sitting on board for its opponent to sort of bounce back with cards. And this also isn't really getting rid of those resources like a discard effect. This is just trying to make it inaccessible for a turn. So it's not really even a control piece, it's more of like a denial option to maybe cheese opponents. It doesn't seem that powerful to me. Next up we have the Hole Digging Shovel. This simply states discard the top 2 cards of your deck. Now, you really need to want to pitch a lot of cards from deck to get any use out of this card, because, you know, it's inherently a pretty bad effect. We have the Brilliant Blender as an ace spec, which can cherry pick 5 cards you guaranteed want in the bin. This one, there's no guarantee of what you're discarding is what you want. Yes, we have some synergy cards like Academy at Night and whatnot, but a lot of setup just to discard some extra pieces. I feel like decks like Ceruledge won't really have the space to commit to a card like this. It already has the Drill Bow with Dig 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 and the Ace spec that you could go for instead. So I think just the randomness of this card makes it still pretty poor, and very rarely is this going to be better than playing just like some discard supporter cards or anything like that.
Next up we have Lumiose Galette. This is a new item card that says heal 20 damage and 1 special condition from your active Pokemon. Now typically these types of effects are quite weak. Honestly, these cards very rarely see play. There's often a very specific use case for a card like this to see play. Think something like a picnic basket, which obviously is rotating out, so there is a bit of space potentially to have some healing in the format. But this only heals the active Pokemon, which isn't really flexible enough for this to be worth a card in your deck. We already have good healing options for tanky decks, think Jumbo Ice Cream, think Wally's Compassion. And when it comes to healing status conditions, most of the time the easiest way of doing this is just using Switch to get out of the active spot. Now, like I say, we do lose Picnic Basket, and that actually is a pretty big deal against Munkidori decks and Dragapult and things like that. But that had a much bigger impact because it also stopped your opponent's Munkidori damage because it healed their board as well. So it worked really well against archetypes that damage their own board, things like Grimmsnarl. And unfortunately, just healing for 20 on your active Pokemon is not going to be good enough to play in any deck right now. We've got much better options for healing damage and special conditions, and because of that, it's just not worth it.
Moving on to our supporter cards then, we start with Tarragon. Put up to 4 in any combination of fighting Pokemon and basic fighting energy from your discard pile into your hand. Now, fighting has a ton of support already, with Fighting Gong, with Premium Power Pro, and of course the Lunatone Soul Rock package in here. So already you have to think that Tarragon may find a way within these sorts of deck lists simply because it can reload fighting energy for you to continue to use Lunar Cycle throughout the entire game. There's also some new synergy cards coming in this set, most notably the Stage 1 Barbaracle that has the Stone Arms ability that allows you to accelerate energy from hand to your fighting Pokemon. So there's definitely a synergy here where it can sort of reload an attacker and Barbaracle can flood those energies coming into your hand all onto the board. So there might be some minor synergy here in just a generically good recovery card that is unique to the fighting stuff, because really it's down to like Night Stretcher for the majority of decks as of right now, so fighting having this boast is pretty good, and I could see this going into the likes of Mega Lucario or Cynthia's Garchomp, perhaps as one-off style cards. Because we have Meowth in format now, you can cherry pick this at the right time, and it could be, you know, a multiple copy card in a Barbaracle list. Although by that same merit, I do think Night Stretcher sets a really high bar for recovery, and especially when you're looking at like Megas, for example, when just one of them is knocked out, that's half your opponent's prize card, so you don't need that much recovery in the meta. But I don't think we necessarily need this card too much, and it's not looking like Barbaracle is going to be bursting down any doors. Quick shout out to Hippowdon that synergizes alongside exactly the supporter card, where if you played one this turn, you can discard the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. It has a really high energy attack cost, so it would probably have to combine with Barbaracle, so it's exactly getting the effect of Tarragon that you would expect. You grab those energy as well as your like Hippo line, then Barbaracle accelerates immediately to it, but ultimately it's just a 3-card discard, not really blowing anyone away here.
Next up we have Naveen. Now this is a supporter card that says discard any number of cards from your hand, then draw cards until you have 5 cards in your hand. Now obviously only drawing until you have 5 in hand is pretty weak. It's not really going to be drawing you a huge amount of cards most of the time unless you have a completely empty hand. And we have some great draw options right now. We still have Lily in format. Obviously we lose things like Research and Iono, but we still have Lily, which is just far better than this for drawing a huge amount of cards. And we even have things like Morty's Conviction, where if you really want some discard plus draw synergy in your deck, that's arguably a better option than Naveen. Now, the one upside this does have on Morty is you can discard any number of cards from your hand, so decks that really need some discard synergy, things like Archaladon or Mega Lucario, they could look towards this supporter to get energy into the discard pile to then make use of their abilities and attacks that then can attach that energy. Now, like I say, drawing up to 5 is never going to be the strongest draw support effect, so this won't be your primary draw supporter in decks like that. They're still going to play things like the Lilies to help them get into the game, but I can see it being a 1 or a 2 of in those types of decks because it does help get energy into the discard whilst giving you a bit of added consistency. It also lets you keep key pieces. If you're playing this in like a rare candy deck, you can obviously keep your rare candy and try and draw into the Pokemon you need, but ultimately only drawing until you have 5 in hand still leaves you pretty unlikely to draw the combo you need from a supporter like this, so I think you're still going to be looking towards Lilies for those stage 2 decks that need to have a lot of pieces in hand. That being said though, as an additional 1 or 2 of in some of these specific archetypes that like discarding energy to then attach them through abilities and attacks later on in the game, I can see them potentially adding this as a 1 or a 2 of in their decks just as an additional draw supporter alongside Lily.
A little bit more encouraging is the Rosa's Encouragement supporter card. You can only use this card if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponents, but it attaches up to 2 basic energy cards from your discard pile to one of your stage 2 Pokemon. We of course have a really decent chunk of solid stage 2s still in our metagame, and I think the most notable ones would be the likes of Dragapult EX, Cynthia's Garchomp EX, and possibly even Mega Dragonite EX. I think you always have to think about this in comparison to Crispin, which is a card that you can use throughout the game and is a little bit more flexible because it could even go on to like evolving Pokemon on odd turns where you don't have much else to do. Whereas the Rosa's Encouragement is much more specific in when you can time her, and of course you have already had to have set up your discard pile, and there really isn't much discard synergy in the format right now. It really is like Ultra Ball is your best way to discard stuff, so it's really like a late game synergy card where Pokemon have naturally been knocked out that has then put your basic energy in the bin for you to grab them back with that Rosa's. So it has seen a little bit of play here and there in the Dragapults predominantly, which gives us already like a medium rating for the card, but I personally think Crispin is just still that little bit more versatile. The 2 dragons I mentioned already have like multiple energy in their attack costs, so it feels like it's an inferior option. It is really just the likes of Garchomp that could look at this and think, oh great, this is an instant 2 energy for me to Draconic Buster out of nowhere. But already we have things like Barbaracle that could be making it into Garchomp lists and other forms of acceleration it could look towards, and ultimately Crispin still isn't bad in Garchomp because then you get to use Monkey Dory anyway. So I think right now it kind of lacks homes, even though there are some stage 2s in the meta, because I think the sort of proactive nature of Crispin and the fact that it's more flexible and versatile makes it probably the better option, but this is definitely good acceleration to have in the back pocket for future archetypes as they come out.
On to Jacinthe then. This is another supporter that says heal 150 damage from one of your psychic Pokemon. Now obviously this is very, very specific to one archetype or one type of Pokemon, so its uses are fairly limited, but 150 damage is a huge amount of damage to heal. If your opponent is trying to 2-shot your Pokemon, healing 150 damage a lot of the time is just going to mean that you're pretty much wiping off a turn of damage from your board. You're going to be putting them back a turn and potentially force them to have to attack another time. However, sort of similar to the Lumiose Galette card we talked about earlier on, we already have good item-based healing options right now that aren't type-specific. Now, yes, the Jumbo Ice Cream does require you to have 3 energy attached to your Pokemon, but it's an item, not a supporter card, and therefore you still get to play your supporter for turn, which can be impactful something like a boss or a judge Aura Lilies, rather than having to spend your supporter just doing that heal. We also have Wally right now, which for the Mega decks is arguably just as good. Obviously, you do have to remove the energy with Wally back into your hand, but because of all of that, that really limits the amount of decks that would ever even consider Jacinthe in the first place. Now, we do lose Penny and Churro, so big heal cards are still quite important every now and again, and I can definitely see this being a one-of in the right meta, in the right deck, but right now there's no obvious applications for this card. We have other better options, and it's very expensive to use your supporter for the turn on this type of effect. So until we do have that perfect storm of a specific deck into a specific matchup that needs this type of card, this is just going to be a 1-star from us.
The only stadium coming out in this expansion is the Lumiose City. Once during each player's turn, that player may search their deck for a basic Pokemon and put it onto their bench. Then that player shuffles the deck, and if a player uses this effect, their turn ends. So it's really limited in the window of opportunity to make this card useful, which is really the thing that is a little bit awkward. Now, the good news is that your opponent will basically never get that symmetrical effect off unless they're going to have a passive, like, passing turn anyway, and almost all decks will choose not to do that. They will either be attacking you for damage or doing like an Itchy Pollen or some other sort of setup style effect. So it's really just like this panic option. Maybe it opens doors for like a Chorus Tenacity to be good in your list, where it can then be like a more of a consistency supporter by having Lumiose City within your list. This is at least an option for you. I also think that like we have seen the Noctowl engine in the pre-rotation format use Artisan just to help you get like Fan Rotom into play, so you can commit your ball search towards your terrors. I think it's sort of the inverse effect in this case, where you could commit your ball search to Fan Rotom, and then if you have access to the stadium card, you can end your turn on grabbing a terror, so you're set up with Noctowl shenanigans for the next turn. It's like not going to be that primary stadium, because Area Zero would be better, but just as that extra copy so you're not wrecked by Watchtower, it becomes more of an interesting case. I haven't seen many high placing lists with the stadium within the list, but just that other final nod is that there are still some worthy stadiums bouncing in the meta. Like I said, Watchtower is going to be big for all sorts of decks, not necessarily just ones that are playing Noctowl, because there's going to be Kangaskhan engines, there's going to be Meowth in a ton of decks, of course. So this is the perfect card to help you get to like a critical mass of stadiums in your deck to feel a little bit more confident and comfortable that you can win that stadium war overall, whilst also being like, shrug, it's at least a card I can use in my opening hands when I need it to.
Onto the return of some type-specific special energy then, and the first is going to be the Grow Grass energy. This is a grass-type energy that provides 1 grass energy when it's attached, and if it's attached to a grass-type Pokemon, that Pokemon gets an additional 20 HP. Now this isn't a huge amount of HP, especially in today's day and age, but this could be really important for some specific archetypes, where it actually does provide a pretty substantial increase. I'm thinking exactly of Festival Lead here. Now, Diplin getting an extra 20 HP is actually a 25% increase on its base HP, which is pretty significant. Like I say, this isn't particularly impactful in like a Mega Venusaur deck or whatever, because it's just not a big enough increase. But when you're playing Festival Lead, which has a lot of small one-prize Pokemon with low HP, this is a significant increase against things like Dragapult, where you can try and stop your opponent taking multiple prizes in one turn. This has seen a little bit of play in those Festival Lead archetypes, as well as with a couple of other niche archetypes in Japan in their City League so far. And admittedly, the HP gain is still small enough that it's not going to be massively swinging the matchup in your favour when you're playing Festival Lead into Dragapult. But given that you can just play a couple of these because Festival Lead only has 1 energy attack cost, you're pretty happy just adding a couple of these into your deck just to try and help out in what would normally be a really, really bad matchup. I think one of the biggest downsides to this actually is not synergizing with the likes of Teal Mask and Bug Catching Set. Both Teal Mask and Bug Catching Set require you to be using basic grass energy to be able to attach them to draw cards or search them from the top 7 of the deck, and because of that you're not going to be able to pick up or use your Grow Grass energy with those cards. And that's why the heights of this card are fairly limited. You can't play it with some of the better grassed cards we have in format right now. So I don't think this is going to be massively impactful, but it is a nice addition to that Festival League deck, which does get significantly better post-rotation as we lose some of those archetypes that it really didn't like to see, like Gardevoir, as well as gaining some recent upgrades from other sets like Pokepad to make it more consistent. This will be worth keeping in mind for other grass archetypes going forward, especially if there's a specific grass deck that plus 20 HP keeps you out of range of a certain attack. But for now, we think it's just going to see play in that Festival Lead archetype, if anything.
Then we come on to a jaw-droppingly strong special energy card in the form of Telepath Psychic Energy. This card provides Psychic Energy, and when you attach it from hand to one of your Psychic Pokemon, you can search your deck for up to 2 basic Psychic Pokemon and put them onto your bench. Then shuffle your deck. Yep, Psychic is going absolutely nowhere in the metagame. We have already a number of quite solid attacking options for basic Psychic Pokemon that are already quite tempting to look into. The likes of Lily's Clefairy EX is massive right now for tackling the likes of Lucario and Dragapult. Mega Diancie EX is also a really efficient attacker. Let's not forget, we still have Wonder Patch in the format, so these 2 basics could be powered up really quickly, and with a combination of Basic Energy and this Telepath Energy, you can get into the game quite smoothly and get not just your backup attackers down, but also the likes of Latias EX into play, Monkey Dory's into play, and in quite a scary fashion, Duskull could be brought out into play quite quickly. And this actually has given life to a Diancie Dustoir style deck, just saying that your attack with Diancie is efficient enough with your Wonder Patch. When you can target down certain Pokemon with Dustoir, this could be a really good aggressive beat stick deck, similar to how we've seen the likes of Lopunny Dustoir in the past, where you're a low to the ground strategy. Telepath Energy gives you that consistency of pumping out multiple Duskull early, that suddenly it becomes a strategy all on its own. Similarly, there's been things like Frillish Dustoir showing up in Japanese City Leagues where you eventually build toward Jellicent, but ultimately your early game attachment can set you up for item lock whilst also getting Duskull and Lati into play to get your Frillish into the active and get you really swinging. So just because we already have so many good basic Psychic Pokemon, especially that Skyliner, which seems to be a big deal, seems like it's already just going to have a huge amount of repercussions in the metagame. There are also some interesting evolving archetypes that could take advantage of Pokepad, meaning that they have really good early game basic search, and then Pokepads can see them through to sort of the mid game as you start to evolve up. It gives a lot more reliability to Alakazam, where you can just get an Abra and then it gets 2 more Abras. So something like a Hilda or Chorus Tenacity package could be really powerful in Alakazam going forward, where it can give you this really good early game access to your basic Pokemon, and then you've already stashed a stage 1 to start drawing some cards off of that for the next turn, which is huge. And then something like Slowking, again, you probably still want to play some basic energy for the Wondrous patch, but the fact that you can get multiple Slowpoke down also seems not trivial at all. Also, there has recently been some engines that use Latias and Kangaskhan on its own end to combine nicely with Cypher Maniac. So again, you can attach to your Slowpoke, grab Slowpoke and Lati, move into a Kang, and suddenly you're setting yourself up for a turn 2 Seek Inspiration behind your draw engine. So there's just so many good Psychic Pokemon that I can see a really wide range of ideas with this card. There's even things like Mega Clefable EX coming out in this expansion that are worth looking into, that just get to play 4 copies of an incredible energy card that just gets you into the game. This is so good to see in your opening hands, obviously, but also when you're being hit with item lock in the format, it becomes even just a really good top deck in a lot of situations as well. So this is a massive boon for basically all Psychic strategies, and it simply just adds to the value of the already good abilities we have within Psychic.
Finally, before we jump into the Pokemon then, we have Rock Fighting Energy. This energy provides 1 fighting energy when it's attached, and it says prevent all effects of attacks used by your opponent's Pokemon done to the fighting Pokemon this card is attached to. So what does this actually mean? What does it prevent? Well, it prevents things like special conditions being applied to your Pokemon from attacks like Monkey Dory. It prevents damage counters being placed on your Pokemon by attacks from things like Dragapult's Phantom Dive. And it also prevents effects like your Pokemon being automatically knocked out as part of an attack. Think Mega Absol's terminal period, that kind of thing. It would prevent you being able to get knocked out by that attack. So it's definitely a card with a lot of future potential, but are there any archetypes right now that this would actually actively help against? Well, like I mentioned, there are still a fair few decks playing Monkey Dory, so being able to stop yourself getting confused is quite useful. But now we don't have Gardevoir anymore, it's actually a lot more unlikely for these decks to actually be attacking with Monkey Dory. And there's a couple of other status conditions around, think things like Mega Electros or Regice EX, but right now there's not a huge amount of status, and we always have things like Switch to be able to get out of status conditions as well. Like I mentioned with that card earlier on Lumiose Galette, there's often very good ways of being able to get rid of status conditions where you don't need to worry about them too much, so I don't think that's the best use for Rock Fighting Energy. The other use is, of course, trying to prevent something like a Dragapult from dealing damage to your bench Pokemon with the damage counters that they place. Say you're playing something like a Lucario deck, you could protect your Riolus from Dragapults trying to take prizes on them on the bench. And Dragapult does look to still be a really solid archetype in the post-rotation meta, so I think it is still going to be very popular and one to keep in mind. But they're also playing things like Dusknoir, which get around this because this only prevents effects of attacks, not abilities. Now, we do have Psyduck alongside it, and maybe certain decks will play Rock Fighting Energy plus Psyduck to completely eradicate any way from a Dragapult from being able to damage their opponent's bench. But that's just one matchup, and I already think some of these fighting decks can go toe-to-toe with Dragapult because they have great ways of being able to knock out Dragapult in one hit, and Dragapult can't recover as easily now that they don't tend to play Neo Upper anywhere near as often. They have to play things like Crispin. So sometimes I think you're just going to be able to race the Dragapult decks with your fighting archetype, which means, you're going to be less worried about them damaging your bench Pokemon with their damage counter placement. Now, we do have Mega Absol right now, which can take an automatic KO with its terminal period attack. And something like a Mega Lucario or a Mega Zygarde really doesn't want to see that because you just give up 3 prizes instantaneously. And Absol did win the latest Champions League, so it is still a relevant matchup. So we do need to keep this in mind for fighting decks going forward because of how well Absol did. Finally, it's worth noting we also have Mist Energy in format right now, and that really isn't seeing a huge amount of play. Now, this is type specific, so you do get a fighting energy instead of a colorless energy, but still, if we were in a format where we had to prevent a lot of effects, Mist Energy would be seeing a lot more play than it is. So I think we can kind of take that as evidence that Rock Fighting Energy won't be too impactful either. The other downside to this special energy is it does have anti-synergy with things like the Lunarock engine, as well as Lucario or Barbaracle acceleration archetypes. So a lot of the time you're actually going to wish this was a basic fighting energy so you could discard with Lunatone and draw more cards, or actually reattach the energy with Lucario or Barbaracle. But instead this is just going to be trapped in your hand or in the discard pile, and you're not going to be able to make use of it. Now, obviously, there were a few matchups that I mentioned there, and maybe there's enough matchups for this to be worth it as a 1 or a 2 of, and you just have to accept that sometimes you're going to draw it when you wish it was a basic energy when you're playing Lunarock or Lucario or something like that. But I think this isn't going to be a staple until we have more matchups that this is going to be impactful in, so likely only a 1 or a 2 of at best.
Moving on to EX Pokemon then, we start off with Decidueye EX. It's a 320 hit point grass type that has the Sniper Eye ability. If your opponent has exactly 4 cards in their hand, ignore all colourless in this Pokemon's attack cost, meaning that Crush Arrow goes from a 4 energy attack cost down to just 1 grass energy, and suddenly it becomes an efficient option within your deck. 240 damage and discard an energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. Now, grass is still a pretty decent type actually to have in post-rotation. First of all, the weaknesses that you get to hit are pretty good. You get to damage Garchomps, Zoros, Absols, and Grimmsnarls. These are all still like really relevant decks in the metagame, so being able to one-shot those for 1 energy already really appealing. Also, the fact that this comes with a discard an energy from your opponent's active is like cream on top, where now it's a headache for the Dragapults. Now they're forced to play like Crispins on multiple turns to maintain their Pokemon, so I do think there's something to be said there that you are slowly chipping away your opponent's Pokemon and setting up damage. 240, like, it's a slightly annoying threshold. Yes, it's getting you through the majority of basic EXs, but just slowly two-shotting into stage 2s, not necessarily ideal, especially because Sniper Eye isn't always going to be an ability that's online, right? There's going to be situations where you don't, or your opponent doesn't have exactly 4 cards in hand. That's where the Big Wings Vivillon comes in, where once during a turn you may have your opponent shuffle their hand and put all of those cards to the bottom, and then they draw 4 cards. So this ability is actually like pretty good in a meta where, again, we lose so many good disruption supporters. The fact that you can be throwing your opponent down to lower and lower hand sizes all the time actually seems like quite a good deal, and then it also helps that Sniper Eye actually come into effect. And it may seem like really rough to try and sprout multiple stage 2s into play, but at least they're in grass, right? So you can use bug catching sets, you can use forest, you can use your Pokepads to try and get you there. And I also just wanted to take a quick note on some of the evolving basics for Decidueye. First of all, Rowlet. Yes, it has 80 hit points. That's like a good and a bad thing. It's like okay for not being too worried about Dragapult shenanigans, but it's not poffinable, of course, but already you're going to go for bug catching sets, I would think. But it does have the Find a Friend attack, which gives you at least a little bit more consistency going on in there, but also Dartrix, because we will be evolving up probably not via candies, but instead via our stadium. You could think about having Relicanth in here and go for the Feather Shot approach, discarding all energy attached to this Pokemon and choosing one of your opponent's Pokemon and doing 90 damage to that Pokemon. Because you can take advantage of Sniper Eye here, you could Feather Shot for free. And this actually reminds me a bit of Arboliva EX, which has already done way more than I ever expected in the post-rotation metagame, simply by having like a really good efficient sniping attack. Now, it serves a slightly different purpose in the deck that it was in, but the fact that Dartrix can take those early prize cards while you build towards Crush Arrow to be more relevant for you, I think is pretty interesting, where you can, if your opponent has all single prize boards, you can pick off the things they're evolving up in the back, knowing that Crush Arrow will be the better option when they start evolving up into their own Stage 2 Pokemon. So, thought it's vaguely interesting. Yes, it requires a lot of work, but simply because Grass has so much going for it in post-rotation, both in terms of type coverage and card pool, I think it's quite interesting.
Next up, we have Salazzle EX. This is a 260 HP Fire-type Pokemon. With 2 attacks, it's got Nasty Plot and Fatal Nail. Nasty Plot says search your deck for any 2 cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And Fatal Nail deals 100 damage, and your opponent's active Pokemon is now poisoned and burned, and then you switch Salazzle to your bench. Now, it's a real shame that I don't think this card is good enough, because Salazzle is definitely one of my favourite Pokemon. Obviously, that first attack letting you search for 2 cards is okay. We have worse disruption tools right now than we have pre-rotation. We lose Iono, so you are potentially more likely to keep those cards to be able to help you build towards some kind of combo. But typically, you need to be building towards something with an attack like this, and I just don't think Fatal Nail is worth building towards. Fatal Nail deals 100 damage, and then with the poison damage, with the burn damage, it's technically 130, so even that's not great. It deals with 1 prize Pokemon, but it's sometimes not even 2-shotting 2 prize or 3 prize Pokemon, which is quite weak. Now, we do have ways of buffing the poison damage and the burn damage. We have Peturant, which you could easily switch into to get an additional 5 counters from the poison, and we've got Magmortars to buff up the damage from the burns. So you could potentially be getting up to like 200 damage if you have the perfect board state, I guess. But best case scenario, only dealing 200 damage really isn't that good, and even if you are retreating to the bench and hiding behind a 1 prize Pokemon or something like that, maybe you could hide behind some kind of wall like a Crustle or a Cornerstone, but realistically, you're just going to end up having your Salazzle boss KO'd, and it's only a 260 HP Pokemon, so it's not going to be difficult to get a KO on it. And, you know, there's no synergy between that and some of the walling Pokemon, so there's just nothing outstanding going on here. You can't play all of the damage mods as well as walls, realistically. It's just nothing particularly impressive to build around with Salazzle, which is a shame because it's always cool when Salazzle gets featured in the TCG because it's really unique in that it can make use of poison and burn as one Pokemon. It's always really, really cool. But unfortunately, this Salazzle EX is just not good enough, and this is going to see no play when this comes out.
We also have this Lapras EX, a 210 hit point basic water Pokemon with 2 attacks. The first is Hydro Turn, does 30 times, 30 for each water attached to this Pokemon, and then you switch this Pokemon while you're benched. Yes, hit and run is decent, but there aren't that many great walls right now. Maybe some stage 1s like Milotic EX, Farigiraf EX, Crustle could be worth considering, but ultimately not great things to be sort of hit and running into right now, even though this can eventually stack up with more damage over time, and that's something you always want to keep an eye out for with hit and run, but ultimately there's still going to be lots of boss in decks, and it's going to be difficult to deny that from the opponent. And then Surf for 3 water just as 140 vanilla. Clearly horrific for the attack cost, and overall this Lapras is pretty much bulk. Then we go on to Mega Starmie EX. This card has already had a really interesting sort of life cycle where it literally hit the ground running in the City Leagues, where it was just absolutely dominating a ton of early tournaments, but then it sort of petered out quite early on. So the way in which we saw it have early success in Japan was combining it with Frostlass and Munkidori and using this as like a replacement to Grimmsnarl as being a really consistent turn 2 potential attacking threat, sitting in the active position with 330 hit points, and having that 1 energy Jet Blow attack being the core selling point of the card. For 1 water, you deal 120 and 50 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And honestly, this 50 damage bench spread stacks up quite nicely up against Grimmsnarl's 30, because a lot of the time here, the idea is that Jet Blow is going to be tackling multiple evolving Pokemon in one go. Like, over 2 turns, you can deal with Drakloaks, which is, again, one of, like, the crucial cards. You can deal with even, like, the Riolus and whatnot. So you can deal with Lunatone in particular, because you have Freezing Shroud to help you, and usually by that point you start getting punched, and ideally if you can tank hits, your Adrenabrain is online, just like a Grimmsnarl would, right? The sort of issues with Starmie in the way it's built and why it sort of started to dip in popularity is that that entire engine basically doesn't have any draw power at all, right? Similar to Grimmsnarl, it really just relies on being like this on-board deck. And I think there's a bigger risk when leading into a Mega Evolution Pokemon being hand disrupted just being left with nothing, because you're then giving up half the prize cards all in one Pokemon. Whereas like in Grimmsnarl, as again the sort of counterpoint and as to why that's seeing more play again, is that if that Pokemon sits in play and gets its sort of like 2 attacks in, it's really got its value. Whereas if a Starmie gets 2 attacks in and then is dealt with, or if it only gets 1 attack in, even worse, right? You are then in a position where you're really behind and you don't simply have enough turns to make your Adrenabrain and Freezing Shroud count. Whereas I think that Grimmsnarl has that time more at its disposal, and even though it is engineless, it at least has that stadium card that can keep you building into Grimmsnarls, provided your opponent doesn't bounce that stadium. And there will be a number of decks that play like a huge count of stadiums, but there will be a decent amount of decks that play just like 1 or 2 copies. So having that spike buff around being more reliable than Starmie seems to be the way a lot of people are going right now. But I also have to give credit where credit's due. This was really hammering through a bunch of City Leagues early, either with Frostlass Monkey Dory, sometimes even Frostlass the Mega as well. But also there's been some interesting builds again with Dustoir and Dusclops and whatnot, where you're just trying to cheese the game early with just like completely taking away a ton of Pokemon and stopping your opponent from ever getting any evolutions into play. But the way in which engines have started to already adapt in the format means there will be more splashes of like basic EXs and even just random Kangaskhan's being thrown into deck lists, so they're not being like instantly railroaded by Jetblow taking like a couple early prize cards. So something to bear in mind, the Japanese format like already have respected this card and are adapting their lists accordingly. So that's why it's seeing a bit less success. It could still do quite well in the early stages of our developing meta.
Onto another Mega then. This is Mega Clefable. It's a Psychic type 320 HP Pokemon with an ability, Wings of Light, and Shooting Moon as its attack. Wings of Light says prevent all effects of your opponent's abilities done to this Pokemon. That's pretty good. It's going to prevent things like Dusknoir and Dusclops from being able to deal damage to you, which is pretty nice. And as well as that, it stops things like Monkey Dory's Adrenabrain, as well as gusting effects like Hariyama's Heave-Ho Catcher. Preventing effects like Dusknoir's does definitely mean Clefable has a bit more survivability compared to some of the other Megas, which is nice. It's going to mean that you're hopefully not giving up 3 prizes quite as easily as some of the other Mega decks do. But obviously it doesn't really protect your little guys, it doesn't protect your Clefairies that these have to evolve from, so Dusknoir will still have targets unless you're playing something like a Psyduck alongside this as well. But just making it a little bit harder for your opponent to take the 3 prizes on Mega Clefable is going to be really important. Especially as Shooting Moon, Mega Clefable's attack doesn't deal a huge amount of damage, it deals 120 for 2 energy, but you may discard up to 4 energy cards from your hand, and if you do, the attack does 40 more damage for each card you discard. That means you can be dealing a maximum of 280 damage with this attack, which is pretty good for dealing with some of the Stage 1 EXs, some of the basic Megas, things like Absol and stuff like that. You can actually KO this in one shot, which is nice. And with scalable damage, it means that you're able to just deal a little bit of damage if you're going to have to 2-shot something, rather than having to discard 4 energy cards just to get over to 280 every single time. You can just discard the right amount to be able to 2-shot something easily. It also works really well alongside Lily's Clefairy if you're dealing with Dragapult as well, because it means you can just discard 1 energy card with Shooting Moon, deal 160 times 2 because of Lily's Clefairy's ability, and easily be one-shotting a Dragapult, which is really nice. I think it's actually going to be a pretty good matchup for this archetype, especially when you also consider we have a 1-prize Clefable from Ascended Heroes, which lets you copy an opponent's active Pokemon's attack. That really reminds me of the old Mew EX that used to be paired with Lily's Clefairy, and you're going to be able to really do some devastating stuff against Dragapult with this as just a 1-prize Pokemon as well, which is really nice. You sometimes won't even need to get a 3-prize Pokemon out to be able to really cripple their setup, which is pretty cool. There's also obviously some other big attacks you can copy. I mean, imagine going up against a Mega Lucario, already going to be great in that matchup because you have Psychic Weakness, but with this archetype you can just copy the Lucario's second attack with Clefable and one-shot a 3-prize Pokemon with your 1-prize Pokemon. There's going to be lots of situations where a Clefable is going to be able to do that, which is going to be really cool. Psychic's also just a really good type right now because we have a lot of good consistency for them. We have Mystery Garden to be able to draw a lot of cards and get some energy into the discard pile, and then we've got Wondrous Patch to be able to attach that energy for some energy acceleration. We've got Telepath energy for getting lots of your basics out. That's going to be really good for helping set up, as well as things like Pokepad and Buddy Buddy Poffin, so you're going to be able to get into the game really consistently, which is nice. So I think this archetype has a lot of potential, and there's a new 1-prize Pokemon, Aromatisse, that we'll talk about a little bit later on, that lets you search your deck for energy to be able to power up Shooting Moon. So I think there's naturally a really good synergy between these two Pokemon, and I can see this being quite a fun archetype to play, to be honest. You're going to be able to search out your energy with Aromatisse, you're going to be able to do a huge amount of damage with with Shooting Moon, then shuffle them all back in with things like Energy Recycler, and just cycle this over and over again to try and take some cool KOs. And whilst it's not going to be doing anything like unfair, definitely seems like it could be a pretty consistent mid-tier archetype that can compete with some of these top-tier archetypes going forward.
Onto Mega Zygarde EX then. It's a 310 hit point fighting basic Pokemon that has 2 attacks here. The Gaia Wave for 3 fighting energy deals 200, and during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon takes 30 less damage from attacks, and Municus 0 for 5 fighting energy. For each of your opponent's Pokemon, flip a coin. If heads, this attack does 150 damage to that Pokemon. So I'm going to jump down to the second attack first and just say that this is like a terrifying attack, but because of its high energy attack cost, even with the acceleration of the likes of Barbaracle perhaps, I think usually your opponent will have long enough time to build up into multiple evolution Pokemon to a point where you're not just like completely cheesing a game. But what I do think is interesting is that this can be a way for you to win on board with Zygarde without requiring boss's orders. And when the format is moving more and more to a position of like, okay, as we get to the late game, as long as I can find my stamp, I can dodge a boss and survive. Zygarde doesn't allow your opponent to even have that line of play, because at any point, this second attack, you know, provided you flip heads on the right targets, of course, can help you like close a game, which is a scary thing to have in the arsenal of Zygarde. But the Gaia Wave also just like a pretty decent, efficient attack. 200's not a great amount of damage, but you are reducing damage coming back into yourself. And I think if this can get its 2 prize cards worth on like a Meowth or a Fez, don't forget as well, of course, we do have Premium Power Pro. So within our list, we can pump this damage up to deal with other basic EX Pokemon. You can get your 2 prize cards out of it, tank up, and say that because of that reduction especially, it's difficult for this Pokemon to be dealt with all in one turn. And there actually is a stealthy third attack available to Zygarde, because it does have that core memory tool available to it. That Geobuster for 4 fighting does 350 damage and discards all energy from this Pokemon. So it's a really, really good chunk. It's going to get you through basically all Megas that aren't Stage 2 Mega Pokemon. And even then, you could argue there's Premium Power Pro that could push Zygarde into knocking out basically anything in format. And yes, it's that big discard, but I think the idea with Zygarde is that, like, you get in with your Gaia Wave, take 2 prize cards on something, tank a turn, then Core Memory can take your, like, final 3 prize cards. So in a world where Megas are dominating, I think Zygarde is really, really intriguing. But that might not necessarily be the world we live in, and one of the worst bits of news for Zygarde is that it has that grass weakness, and grass weakness is a real problem right now because Teal Mask Ogopon is seeing so much play in so many archetypes. It's the face still of the Terra Box, it's really good in Raging Bolts, there's even just like grass builds entirely built around the Teal Mask. It's seeing so much play right now as like an engine mon, as well as a draw mechanic, and simply because it's like an efficient attacker, that's really bad news for Zygarde. So you may end up building a Zygarde EX Barbaracle deck and then find that in so many matchups you'd have to lean into something like a Hawlucha instead and hope that that can be carrying you through coin flips. So even though there's a really good engine here and I can see the vision, I can see that if simply more Megas are going to be dominating in the game, this is going to be a really, really useful card. But right now, with a swarm of Ogopon around, it's a difficult card to justify.
Next up then we have Yveltal EX. This is a 210 Dark-type Pokemon with 2 attacks. It's got Destructive Soul that says knock out each of your opponent's Pokemon that has 50 HP less or remaining, and then Dark Strike that deals 210 damage, and during the next turn this Pokemon can't use Dark Strike. Now that second attack isn't really worth talking about, but the first attack, Destructive Soul, is definitely very interesting, and I think there could be some potential uses for this. It's going to be a really difficult attack to power up and to set up, but could be pretty devastating, to be honest, against some certain archetypes. Now, given this costs 3 energy, you're definitely going to need some energy acceleration, and the best is probably Toxtricity, and that's kind of where we've seen it see play in Japan so far in their city leagues. The damage that you put on your Pokemon with Toxtricity alongside Monkey Dory can then be thrown over to your opponent's side of the field to potentially get their Pokemon down to less than 50 HP. So then Destructive Soul is going to be able to take hopefully multiple KOs at once, being able to really cripple your opponent's board. And I think there's 2 ways of looking at this attack. The first way is trying to take out multiple evolving basics on turns 2 or 3. If you really get very, very lucky in trying to get multiple Toxtricities out, maybe you can try and get some damage over onto their board, a couple of turns of Toxtricity, gives you enough damage counter to then move over with Monkey Dory, and then trying to use Destructive Soul to take out multiple evolving basics, especially if your opponent is going a little bit of a slower route, maybe they're manually evolving up rather than using Rare Candy and stuff like that. I do think that's one way of trying to power up and abuse this attack, I guess. And then the second way is to try and wipe out all of your opponent's attackers in one hit, similar to like a Devo style strategy that we've seen in the past when we had TM Devo in format. Deliberately leaving your opponent's Pokemon on certain HP breakpoints without taking knockouts, leaving them on 50 HP or less, and then taking multiple knockouts at once with Destructive Soul to either win on the spot or just try and leave them with nothing so that they're not able to mount any kind of comeback before you then win the game over the next couple of turns. Pokepad definitely gave Toxtricity a boost in consistency, and I definitely think it's a bit of a better deck, more respectable deck in the post-rotation format. There's still some really good dark attackers to play in this archetype, which is cool. But this is still a lot of effort to get set up, and a lot of the time, your opponent might be able to see it coming. They might be able to heal enough damage out of range for Destructive Soul to then not be able to get a KO, or start setting up another attacker to be prepared for when you use this attack. And because of that, I just don't think it's actually going to see any successful play overall. The attacks just cost a little bit too much, they're a little bit too awkward to play into, and even though we have a better engine in Toxtricity than we did before, I still just think leaning into something like a Mega Absol or even like a Mega Sharpedo might actually just be better.
Moving on to metal stuff, we have Mega Skarmory EX. It's a 260 hit point metal type Mega that just has the Sonic Ripper attack. For 2 metal and 1 colorless, you shuffle all energy from this Pokemon into your deck, and this does 220 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. It's a bit of a tall order really to think about this card because the hit points are so low that you have to time it really, really carefully, otherwise your opponent will punish it, and shuffling energy back into your deck is not ideal. However, because metal has so much acceleration, there could still be some options here. We do have Metang, and Metal Maker actually works really nicely with energy being put back into the deck. It gives you higher odds of finding them again with your makers on the next turn. Also, Steven's Metagross EX, with its X-Boot ability, is accelerating from the deck, so it does have synergy with 2 really good abilities in Metal. There is also Archaludon EX, but it's a bit more clunky, because Assemble Alloy is from the discard pile. We're already lacking discard synergy cards in the format. It's like Carmine, Morty, and like Explorer's Guidance, some really janky stuff, right? So it doesn't seem to be a great option in that deck. But what Skarmory can do, again, that sort of same instance of now when you're getting hit with Stamp, you can draw into something like Lily's Determination and draw your way into Skarmory that can then give you like the Pheasantipity knockout or the Meowth knockout that you need to take those final couple prize cards. So for Metal, having this option to be a game ender is at least intriguing, but Metal isn't like that insane right now. It feels like the big issue with Metal generally is that both Mega Skarmory and Mega Warwile are like both endgame closing cards, and you can't like time the right one, especially with Hand Disruption coming in, to be like a really useful option. So it's like the beginning of a metal box where both these Megas are just sort of waiting their turn to be really busted, whether it's like you've just taken enough prize cards to knock through anything in the active, or Skarmory can be cheeky if your opponent's trying to throw a single prize Pokemon into that equation. But it's more about like what you do in those opening stages to really get you going in the game, because with Genesect EX, you have to give credit to Metal. Like, it should be able to get pretty consistently into games. It's about how you close them, and this, in theory, is a good game closer, but in practice may end up being like a useful card in like 1 in 10 games.
Finally then, for the EX Pokemon, we have Meowth EX, and I think this is pretty certain that this is going to be the best card in the set. Meowth EX is a 170 HP, colourless type Pokemon with the Last Ditch Catch ability that says when you place a Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may search your deck for a supporter card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. And you may only use one ability with Last Ditch in its name per turn. I think that's really interesting, and we'll come back to why momentarily. Now, we've seen this ability printed loads of times before, and every time this ability is printed, it always sees a huge amount of play, and I think there's going to be no difference here with Meowth. I think it's going to be really, really good. And actually, so far, pretty much every deck in the post-rotation format is running Meowth, unless they're like a 1-prize archetype who really wants to stay as 1 prize as possible. Pretty much every 2 and 3 prize archetype is running Meowth just as a super good consistency tool, because that's exactly what it is. It's going to turn your 4 Ultra Balls into supporters. You're going to have an additional 4 outs to finding a supporter on the first turn of the game, and we already have great first turn supporters. We have Lily right now, so just being able to use Lily so much more consistently is going to mean that every deck gets to play the game, gets to set up so much more, and it's just so good to have a card like this right now. With rotation, we also lose a significant amount of consistency supporters. We lose Research, we lose Arven, we lose Iono. So we are at a smaller amount of supporters in format right now that you will want to see on turn 1. So because of that, Meowth gets even better because it means that we don't need to have a super high count of supporters in our deck. We've got these Ultra Balls that turn into Meowth that turn into supporters, and we don't need to worry too much about losing all of these really good turn 1 supporters like Research, Arven, and Iono, because it just gets completely mitigated by having supporters accessible via abilities. This also lets you play more tech like one-of supporters, things like your random disruption supporters like Xerosic's Machinations, or your recovery supporters like Lana's Aid. All of those supporters get so much better when you have so many more outs to being able to find them on the key turn that you need them, because all of your Ultra Balls can also find them as well. And as expected, this is seeing a huge amount of play in Japan. Like I say, only some specific 1-prize archetypes that really want to be purely 1-prize don't play this a lot of the time. 2-prize archetypes, all of the evolving stage 2 decks that really want some added consistency, all of them are playing this card. It's just that good. And if you end up starting it, it's Tuck Tail attack for 3 colourless energy, deals 60 damage, and you get to put Meowth and all cards attached to it back in your hand, so you do still get to use that last ditch catch ability. If you end up having to start this in your game, it's still able to be reused a bit later on. Now, I do think it's really interesting that it's a colourless type. Colourless is already very, very counterable with Watchtower. It's going to mean that some people may decide to play Watchtower alongside some kind of disruption supporter like a Harlequin or a Judge to stop Meowth being an out to try and get you back into the game. And we already have a lot of good, consistent colourless Pokemon. We have Noctowl, we have Kangaskhan. Obviously, we lose Pidgeot, but all of these cards were already being countered by Watchtower in certain matchups anyway. So I think making Watchtower better and better makes it much more likely that we're going to see this as a tech card to try and stop your opponent being able to do what they want. It's already going to have some use against everything because of this Meowth, but it's going to be really powerful against things like the Noctowl decks as well. So I think Watchtower isn't going anywhere, and obviously Meowth just kind of gets caught in the crossfire because of that. But yeah, this card is incredible. It's going to see a lot of play. It's really cool that it's on a Meowth as well. Meowth's obviously a fan favourite Pokemon, so pretty cool that we get to see a fun Meowth card doing well. And I do think it's really interesting, this card text about only able to use one ability with Last Ditch in its name per turn. Just a small nod to that, because it could mean we could see some very powerful abilities coming back to the game that are wrapped up in this Last Ditch sort of card text. So yeah, keep an eye out for them going forward. I'm really interested to see whether they introduce any very powerful abilities back into the game because of that. But for now, we just have this Meowth, though what an entry into the game this Meowth is going to have. Definitely the best Pokemon in the set, and one that I'm going to be playing in pretty much all of my decks post-rotation.
Onto the non-rulebox Pokemon then. Quick shout out to Serperior. It's a grass type stage 2, and simply because we have so much grass support, we have to give it credit. It has 2 attacks here. Royal Command for just 1 grass does 20 times the number of Pokemon you have in play. Now, we do have Area 0 Underdepths, we have Teal Mask, so we could effectively have 9 Pokemon in play and be dishing out 180 for 1 energy. And we also have Brave Bangle and Serperior EX with Regal Cheer that can buff that damage even more. So in theory, again, with Butt Catching Set, you can pull out all these Pokemon quickly, build up into an early Serperior and start pressuring, but the damage cap is still like pretty low. It's not really a big boast to be doing, like, jumping through all these hoops just to have middling damage output isn't really that appealing. It does also have a second attack that combines with Rosa's Encouragement, dealing 250 damage if you have a Rosa in your discard pile. Kind of reminds me of like an Ethan's Typhlosion style deck where you pop one in there and usually you're going to be using the Rosas, right? And then suddenly you're dishing out 250 damage. Again, with Serperiors and Brave Bangles, that can push into quite dangerous range, but you need to have really specific hands. It's difficult for you to like use the Rosa on certain specific turns. You don't really want to be doing like Teal Mask, Venusaur stuff just to power up a Serperior, right? You're going to have a slightly janky list going on to make it all come together. And even then you're going to be shy of knocking out opposing like stage 2 EXs unless you have the ideal board set up. So a cool card, lots of grass energy, so you have to give it credit, but ultimately I'm not too impressed.
On to Vivillon then. This is a 120 HP grass type with the Big Wings ability that says once during a turn, you may have your opponent shuffle their hand and put all of those cards to the bottom of their deck. Then your opponent draws 4 cards. Now, this ability is a bit annoying for your opponent to deal with, especially when we don't have great consistent ways of being able to disrupt the opponent. You can do this every turn. And having Forest in format means that you can obviously evolve into this quite quickly. You get to bench your Scatterbug, evolve into Spooper, and then evolve into your Vivillon, all in one turn, which can surprise your opponent and stop them from being able to actually prepare for their hand being disrupted down to 4 cards. but realistically the use cases of this card aren't really there. We talked about the Decidueye EX earlier on, and obviously this pairs very, very well with that card. It means that your Crush Arrow attack only takes 1 grass energy to deal 240. That's very efficient, and again, when you have Forest to be able to set this up all in one turn, it actually can apply a decent amount of pressure. But I do still think this archetype, again, really isn't unfair enough to actually have a particularly big presence in the meta. And maybe this could be used as like a control tool if you're able to just continually shuffle your opponent's hand back to the bottom of their deck. That could be quite annoying, but they do still get 4 cards, so they still have a number of options to be able to play with after that. So you're potentially going to need to pair it with like an Airy or something to also try and cause a bit more disruption, get rid of some of the items in their hand as well. But if we're being honest, that's not going to be enough to build a whole control strategy around, so I think the use cases for Vivillon are pretty small. And because of that, I don't expect this to be too impactful in the meta overall.
Moving on to Talonflame, it's a stage 2 fire type that we're really only interested in the Sky Hunt ability here, where once during your turn you may flip a coin. If heads, your opponent discards a random card from their hand. And this, of course, is a stackable effect, and I'm actually low-key intrigued by just how powerful Dawn and Pokepad are in the format. Is there ever going to be this turning point where we can have these tech stage 2 lines within our list and just make the most out of it, whether it's this card, whether it's Togekiss, whether it's like an engine Pokemon? That's really what I want to start exploring, because this effect is like low-key quite annoying, especially with some of the supporters we have in the format. We have Airy, we have Xerosic's Machinations, even things like Judge could be annoying for opponents, where you then start sky hunting after that use of supporter, and you can sort of grief your opponent. Now, it's a lot to fit into a deck list, and it's not always going to come off at the right time, but again, because we're lacking those disruption supporters, it is at least intriguing to me. Something like a Claw of Darkness combination with it could be pretty cool. We also do have already in format a way to like zero hand your opponent with Salazzle plus Xerosic's Machinations, and that even has that new Salazzle EX, of course, that can search out combo pieces to try and get you there. So I don't think Talonflame will be like the face of a control deck where you just play like a full thick 4/4/4 line, a bunch of Pokepads and Dawns, and then you have like a Milmon in the active. I don't think that's going to be the direction, because I think Salazzle probably does the handlock thing that little bit better and is like less resource intensive to make it happen. But I am at least intrigued with the idea of having this thin evolution line within my deck, having coin flips to randomly choose my opponent. Now, does the Togekiss perform that role better? Almost certainly. So we still have to give this card a low rating. But I wanted to drive home the fact that, like, just because we lack so many good supporter cards, giving yourself a reason to play Dawn within your deck then has like more upside. And I think that's the thing to explore over anything else.
Onto Dewgong, and this is a really exciting one. It's 130 HP water type with the washout ability that says as often as you like during your turn, you may move a water energy from one of your benched Pokemon to your active Pokemon. So when pairing this with Team Rocket's Spidops, you can use the Spidops' ability to attach water energy from your discard pile to your bench, use washout to push it all up into the active, and power up something into the active every turn that maybe discards energy or naturally has quite a high energy cost to be able to use its attack. I'm thinking something like a Wellspring Mask Ogerpon EX or a Mega Kangaskhan or something like that normally you would have to have some kind of energy acceleration to keep going every turn. I think that's what we could see paired with these two Pokemon. I think it's going to need to be a basic Pokemon just because we're already going to be running 2 different stage 1s that don't evolve from the same basic or have any consistency to them. So I think we're going to need it to be basics just to keep consistent. But we do always have Hydro Pump style attackers as well. There's a couple of those in format, and again, they're not basic Pokemon, so they're not going to be the best. But if you really wanted to go all out, you could do some huge damage with something like a Wailord or a Kingdra EX if you really wanted to go all out. But yeah, the best attackers are going to be things like the Wellspring Masks that can be really, really broken at trying to take 2 prizes every turn, or the Mega Kangaskhan's that are really big and bulky and draw some additional cards to help you set up. Or the other interesting one is that Regice EX from the Ascended Heroes set that lets you discard 2 energy from it to auto-paralyze your opponent's Pokemon. Well, you can easily get the 2 energy back with Spidops plus Washout to be able to do this every turn and cause paralysis every turn, which obviously has a whole host of other issues as well, but they're the kind of things you want to be trying to throw into this Dewgong Spidops box deck that you might want to try and play. And with cards like Pokepad, it is going to be quite consistent to be able to do that as well. So it definitely could be a fun one to try.
We have an Aromatisse coming out, a stage 2 water type with the Tundra Wall ability, which is kind of the core selling point here. While this Pokemon is in play, all of your Pokemon that have water energy attached take 50 less damage from attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. This ability does not stack. It does also have the Freezing Chill attack for 2 water and a colorless. It deals 150, and during your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon can't attack. Actually, low-key a little bit of an annoying option because there isn't much pivoting going on in the format, mostly just like air balloon shenanigans, so the attack is expensive, but like in a panic option it could work. Really, it's about that ability that is like more intriguing, but you have to bear in mind that Aurorus is not a regular evolution. It has to come through the Antique Sail Fossil, which is a 60 hit point colorless basic. Obviously it's an item card here, but it can't be affected by status conditions and can't retreat, but at any time during a turn you can discard it from play, and it has the Protective Sail ability. This Pokemon can't be affected by the effects of supporter cards played from your opponent's hand, so it can't be gusted up by a boss, for example. Which is at least a small bonus, but ultimately like doesn't offset the fact that finding item cards is really terrible right now. We have like Petrol, we have like Drayton, like lots of terrible stuff. You'd have to do some like janky Cypher shenanigans with like Kangaskhan to get them going, but at that stage, we have Bouffalon, we have Curly Wall, and I can't think of any other like low maintenance card that draws enough cards that wants to be a tank that isn't Kangaskhan. I think that's exactly Kang, that exactly has Boof, and I don't think any other card really wants to have this reduction of 50. It's not a high enough reduction for the difficulty to get this Pokemon into play, and ultimately that's the issue.
Just briefly mentioning that Aromatisse I talked about earlier on then, the Fragrance Collection ability. It says once during a turn, you may search your deck for up to 2 basic Psychic Energy, reveal them, and put them into your hand, and then shuffle your deck. Obviously, we're going to be pairing this with Mega Clefable, and it helps be consistent alongside Mystery Garden if you're able to then search out the basic energy for you to then discard and draw some cards. So yeah, just a nod towards this. It's going to be paired pretty much only alongside Mega Clefable. Right now, there's no other home for this, I don't think, but it is going to be a pretty good partner for that Pokemon, so I can definitely see these two working together quite well.
We've already mentioned Barbaracle a couple of times, but just to go over it again, 130 hit point stage 1 Pokemon with the Stone Arms ability. Once during a turn, you may attach a basic fighting energy from your hand to one of your fighting Pokemon. So if ever there was a mega fighting list with Zygarde and Hawlucha, this would probably be the sort of main face of the deck, trying to accelerate a bunch of energy around your board. But I also think this card is vaguely interesting as like a thin 1-1 package going into the likes of Cynthia's Garchomp or into Mega Lucario EX. Now, both of these fighting decks already are quite starved for space on their bench. Like Garchomp already wants to have a bunch of Gabites, usually has those Rosa Raid in play as well, might even look towards Munkidori or into the Lunarok package. And then Lucario oftentimes also has the Lunarok package and usually has Hariyama or Monkeys on their own side. So it really would just be looking at having like a 1-1 package in the deck, but what it does open up is the chance to chain that second attack where they have that really higher damage output threshold to burst through potentially multiple Mega or multiple Stage 2 EXs, provided they have those Premium Power Pro at their disposal and can draw into them. What I think is most interesting is that Mega Lucario can take advantage of Wally's Compassion so nicely here, and in certain instances you could Wally and still get to a Mega Brave play, which could be something your opponent isn't necessarily expecting. They can put you in a position where you can Wally and they can accept that Aura Jab is just going to get a bit of poke pressure. Now the fact that you have Barbaracle changes that dynamic entirely. I think because of the awkwardness of accelerating energy from hand and the fact that these fighting Pokemon already need to have such specific benches, I think it's a card that might not make the cut all too often, but at least there's no shortage of good fighting decks that could squeeze him in.
Onto another fossil then, we've got Tyrantrum here, a 180 HP Stage 2 Pokemon with the Tyranno Guts ability. It says if this Pokemon has any special energy attached to it, it gets an additional 150 HP. And the Wreck Havoc attack for 2 energy deals 160 damage, and you flip a coin until you get tails. For each head, you discard the top card of your opponent's deck. Now, obviously, the idea of this is to play this alongside Rock Fighting Energy, so you end up being a 330 HP one-prize Pokemon that can't be automatically knocked out or have any damage counters placed on you or anything like that, so your opponent just has to deal 330 damage to try and knock you out. And if you're able to get multiple of these set up, obviously 330 damage for just one prize really isn't efficient, so you're really going to be able to force a lot of resources out of your opponent. And honestly, it's pretty impressive if you do get it set up. That's very, very difficult to deal with, and I think if this weren't a fossil Pokemon, this actually would be a little bit interesting, because that's just a huge amount of HP to have to get through for just one prize card. However, unfortunately, the fossil mechanic, as we've mentioned, is pretty bad. compared to playing regular Pokemon, you're just not able to get fossils out anywhere near as consistently. And we've also lost Arven, so that was a big supporter that obviously at least helps you find your item cards to be able to put onto your bench. So just all in all, the fossil mechanic just still really isn't good right now, which really hurts the potential for Tyrantrum, to be honest. Having that huge HP could let you play Relicanth alongside the Tyrant in this set that lets you deal 20 damage times the number of damage counters on this Pokemon. So the idea would be you would have this massive one-price Pokemon that your opponent would hit into, and then you'd be able to deal double damage back to them. That's really, really cool. But it's just completely hindered by the fact that this is a fossil, not a regular Stage 2. I think if it were a regular Stage 2, this, alongside Barbaracle as your energy acceleration, you could actually have a pretty good one-prize deck here, but just the fact that we have to go through this awkward fossil mechanic to try and get these out means it's never going to be worth. Even this overstatted one-prize Pokemon still looks pretty weak, because you just have to jump through so many hoops to actually get it into play. So yeah, overall, a really disappointing one here, because I think the card is very, very good. It's just hindered by the mechanic it's built around.
As for Dark, we have a new Stage 2 Gengar. It's a 130 hit points Pokemon with Infinite Shadow as its ability. If this Pokemon would be knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, instead of discarding it, return it to your hand. Discard all other cards attached to this Pokemon that are not Pokemon. And then it also has the Mind Jack attack. For 1 Darkness Energy, it does 10, plus 30 more for each of your opponent's benched Pokemon. The card itself doesn't look too impressive, but it does have good synergy with the Mega Gengar EX, with that shadowy concealment. When your Dark Pokemon are being knocked out, they take 1 fewer prize card. So the idea really is to bounce off of both of these abilities at once, right? You keep reloading the infinite Gengar that is infinitely not giving up a prize, so long as it's being knocked out by damage from attacks, that is, and you can naturally grab these Pokemon back over and over again and have that efficient 1 energy attacking option. Like, yes, it's only a bit of poke damage, but who cares when you're only giving up 1 prize card? Now, as we already know, Mega Gengar EX isn't seeing like this huge amount of play, and it's not like it's lacked good like single energy basic Pokemon that it could attack with already. So the fact that we have this ability, even within its own evolution line, doesn't change too much. You already had some Pokemon that could do little bits of prodding, and I don't think making your evolution line thicker is going to be the solution to this card's troubles.
For the metal types, we have Doublade. This is a 100 HP metal type Pokemon with the Sword Stash attack that says you may reveal any number of Honedge, Doublade, and Aegislash from your hand. This attack does 60 damage for each card you revealed. Now, obviously, this isn't as good as Goldengo EX, don't get me wrong, but this does give me Goldengo EX vibes, where you're able to search for a load of Pokemon, build up your hand, and then try and deal a huge amount of damage to your opponent's active Pokemon and knock out basically whatever they have in the active spot. Obviously, this time you're searching for Pokemon instead of energy cards, and that has some natural downsides, but we do have a lot of good ways of being able to find a lot of these Pokemon at once right now, which is really cool. We have Dawn, which immediately gets you a Honedge, a Doublade, and an Aegislash all in one, so that's 180 damage. Plus Genesect EX, which lets you search for 2 metal Pokemon to be able to add to your hand, so that's another 2, so that's easily 300 damage with those 5 Pokemon. And that's pretty good for a 1 prize Pokemon. Now, obviously, you do have to keep getting multiple Honedge down so that you don't get completely board wiped, and you have a backup attacker when your Doublade gets knocked out. So there are definitely some limitations. It's not as flexible as if it was energy cards or anything like that. But this could be a really fun 1 prize archetype and has a decent amount of search and consistency to it to actually be a respectable archetype potentially. So far in Japan, it's been paired with Steven's Metagross to be able to get that 2 energy cost set up quite quickly. Obviously, you're able to use Steven's Metagross to attach the extra energy you need every turn, or it's seen play with the Dunsparce as a draw engine, and then Ignition Energy or Crispin as your energy acceleration to be able to chain Doublade should you get knocked out. So yeah, this could be a fun 1 prize archetype. Obviously, you're still capped as your damage output. Like I say, it's not like having a load of energy cards or whatever. You're always going to have to consciously have the additional Honedges down and the extra Doublades to be able to keep chaining those attackers, but I do think this has some potential as a fun 1 prize archetype, so yeah, definitely give this a go. It's a shame we don't have the Mysterious Shield Aegislash or the Aegislash EX anymore. They've both rotated, because I do think that would give another layer to this deck and give you a bit more to do than just this like very linear attack strategy. So yeah, it's a shame that they've rotated, but yeah, this could still be a fun 1 prize archetype for you to try out and give a go.
And we're ending on the Colourless Stage 1 Diggersby here with 150 hit points. It has the Earthquake attack. For 1 Colourless Energy, you deal 140, and you deal 30 to each of your benched Pokemon. Now, surprisingly enough, we have seen things like Centiskorch be tech evolution lines in archetypes, essentially just to help activate your own Munkidori so you can start popping off in a similar sort of vein to something like a Frostlass, where you get a bunch of damage on your side, then you can fling it across to your opponent's side of the board. And to be fair, thanks to Buddy Buddy Poffin and Pokepad, it's actually relatively reasonable to get a turn 2 attack off with this thing, and I think that's kind of most interesting in archetypes that don't really have a good turn 2 pressure play. I'm thinking things like Dragapult or Grimmsnarl that naturally play their Munkidori's, of course, and have energy acceleration so that you can, like, get straight into that mix with Adrenabrain as much as possible. But the one thing that holds me back from an approach like this is that you're basically just falling straight into an unfair stamp, which is so relevant right now in the meta that I feel like getting that early pressure prod and like taking that first knockout is usually not going to outweigh the fact that you could have your entire hand and engine disrupted. It feels like having, for these setup stage 2 decks at least, much more control over the game, building towards multiple evolution lines slower is probably going to be the safer approach, just the way the meta is shaping up right now. But this is definitely one to bear in mind. It's in the likes of like Risky Ruins and Frostlasses, things that activate Munkidori, and Munkidori is a busted card, of course, so you always have to bear this in mind.